us. Let us know on social media because there's plenty of room to compare the two.
Right. So we're going to start off with Europe. Why are we starting with Europe? Well, that is, I think, the foundation for what most people listening to this show have for their idea of a ghost story. And it seems like a good place to sort of cement ourselves, especially, this is not going to be like a literary podcast where we're going to walk through the sort of literary history of ghost stories, but we'll give you like a very, very concise summary before each of these.
Yeah, I should also say that the sort of the European ghost stink manages to work its way into a lot of these other ghost traditions that we're going to discuss.
Yes, it does, for sure. We'll find it on almost every continent, and we had to, when we were choosing what stories we were going to share with you, we had to be very mindful of the sort of European colonial aspect of ghost stories.
Yeah.
So, ghosts and hauntings, they actually appear in European literature as early as the ancient Greeks. Now, obviously, this extends into Shakespeare with literature and drama. We all know the ghost of Hamlet's father that shows up in Hamlet, for instance. Now, here's an interesting thing that I learned with relation to the Shakespeare stuff, though. This is where we get the sheeted ghost from. So the whole idea of somebody just wearing a sheet with holes punched into it to like represent a ghost, it doesn't directly come from Shakespeare, but it comes from dramatic presentations of ghosts on the stage. The reason why was they were originally depicted in armor. So these big suits of armor would be like rigged up on pulley systems and like lowered onto the stage, and that was supposed to invoke a ghost. But as you may imagine, armor's pretty heavy, and that was difficult to pull off every night, so they turned to what they referred to as spirit drapery, and that was essentially putting the sheet over somebody's head, and they would go, ooh. Ghost stories, though, then extended into Gothic literature, and the difference seems to be whether or not the ghost stories themselves had a contemporary setting, and this seems to be fairly important in the European sense of ghost stories. Now, the golden age in literature of ghost stories really seems to kick off in the 1800s. You've got Poe, Sheridan Le Fanu, who we've talked about on the show before, wrote Green Tea. We have a whole episode on his concept of whether or not green tea would make you see hallucinations or ghosts, and lots of others, which leads us to M.R. James, who I really want to talk about here for a second because he's really considered the master of the ghost story. And James lived from 1862 to 1936. He was a college provost. He did not tell ghost stories for a living. In fact, he studied medieval history and the Bible, but he is now known best today as a teller of ghost stories, because what he would do is every Christmas Eve, he would compose a new ghost story, and he would have people come over, whether they were students or acquaintances, and he would present them with a ghost story. And so this is where we get his Ghost Stories of the Antiquary from, and if you haven't read these, I really recommend it. I think they hold up. It is my new holiday tradition to read an M.R. James story every Christmas.
Oh yeah, this is one of the big names in ghost stories for sure.
Yeah, so James wrote an article for a magazine called The Bookman in December 1929, and this was his official 5-point designation of what you needed to have in your European/English ghost story. Okay, so these are the 5 things we're looking for here. To be a true ghost story, the supernatural quality of the ghost can't be explained away with rationality. Okay, so you can't have like a science or pseudoscience kind of explanation.
All right.
The second is that the ghost story itself should inspire the reader with what he calls pleasing terror. So he essentially means like that sort of like adrenaline high that you get when you go to see a horror movie, right?
Okay.
Like the excitement of the fight or flight response of being presented with a horror story. The third is a ghost story should not have gratuitous violence or sex in it, which I thought was interesting, especially where most of our ghost stories go nowadays.
Now I have to say that one of my favorite haunted house books, Richard Matheson's Hell House, is already it's broken 2 of these rules.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think that there's an argument to be made that might have been appropriate for James' time, but you can still make it work nowadays. Ghost stories, this is the last one, should have a contemporary setting where the reader can identify with the protagonist. So basically, it can't be like a period piece, is what he's saying, because you won't necessarily identify with the protagonist as quickly and put yourself in their position. So again, I think you can probably manipulate that. I've seen lots of good ghost stories.
Yeah,
and period pieces.
we're still watching a lot and reading a lot of these older ghost stories, and we don't have any trouble.
Exactly, like M.R.
connecting
James
with them,
ghost
yeah.
stories. Yeah. But let's step back and take a look at James' style in and of himself. Okay, so James wrote ghost stories that were usually set in a small European town. His protagonist was almost always what would be like some kind of gentleman scholar, and they would discover some antique object, and that would kick off the plot to the ghost showing up. He also thought it was really important to build atmosphere and have like an accelerating pace or intensity to these stories' dread. So this leads to his whole pleasing terror idea. The characters in his stories were usually ordinary people, and the reason why is he wanted us, again, to be able to relate to who they are, especially when they're pulled out of their calm environment by something that's ominous or malevolent, right? So again, just being able to put yourself in the shoes of the main characters. Now, after M.R. James in the early 20th century, English ghost stories began to incorporate psychological aspects into them. So when you hear people talk about psychological horror, this is when this kind of kicked off. And I'm thinking here of some of our favorites like Algernon Blackwood and William Hope Hodgson.
Oh yes, both wonderful. Hodgson wrote